Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Brought to you by CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. What's new and exciting in your world this week?
I ran across this article, and I'll read you the headline. For the first time, water produced by sunlight can be even cheaper than tap water. As an economist, I see this statement that this device will do something cheaper than something else. Invariably, whoever's writing this thing leaves out of the equation the cost of the device. They count just operating the thing. Now, I have no idea whether that's the case here, and that's not what my concern is. The whole thing has got me thinking about salt. Here's a device, and let's just assume for the sake of argument that it works and is cheap and all of that. The prototype seems to be like a desk-sized thing that produces a gallon and a half of clean water per hour. So it's a significant quantity. And you can imagine scaling this thing up, and all of a sudden you've got cities popping up in the desert on the shore of the ocean where you can use the ocean water and very cheaply convert it into fresh water. What it's got me thinking about is not the water, but the salt. And of course, we use salt for a variety of things, but I can easily see this producing more salt than what people could use. Salt in large quantities actually becomes a problem. It poisons the ground and kills the flora fauna. We've used it for millennia as a preservative precisely because of that. And in turn, it leads us to an interesting space. A couple of thousand years ago, salt was precious to the extent that some societies actually used it as currency. And now we've reached the point that we are so rich that this thing could actually become a pollutant, simply because we've become so good at producing it.
Well, I'm a little more concerned with the water angle here, but I get the point. The abundance of salt probably going to become a problem sooner or later. What are we going to do with all this damn salt? I have no idea what the correct answer to that question will be. What are we going to do with all this damn water, though, is something that you don't really hear very often. I suspect this is a net gain no matter how you look at it.
Oh, I agree with you. I think it's a net gain. It just interests me. It's kind of like the story about aluminum. You know, aluminum a couple of centuries ago was worth more than platinum, to the extent that the top of the Washington Monument in Washington is capped with an aluminum cap, because this was a fancy, expensive thing to do. And now what? You buy a roll of aluminum foil at the local Aldi for a couple of bucks, wrap your sandwich in it, and throw it out when you're done. 1,000 years from now, do we end up in a place where gold, for example, becomes like that? You use gold foil to wrap your sandwich, throw it away. We've become that rich that things that used to be extremely expensive are now so cheap, they're garbage.
My observation this week is one that I'm shocked you didn't come up with, but we've got student loans set to resume after a 3-year pause, student loan payments. And apparently this is going to impact about 28 million people right away and 54-ish million in the very near future. I've got a couple of observations here. The average student loan repayment is $284 a month. That's not insignificant. That's a fair amount of money. And when you start looking at tens of millions of people who are going to have to repay that, I think we're going to see a shock on the economy that we haven't really foreseen. A bunch of people aren't going to have any disposable income anymore.
I would argue what's going to happen is that money that would have otherwise been going to pay for various things that people might buy is now going to go to the government. It's going to get spent. It's just going to get spent on different things.
Sure, but when you've got 28 million people at an average of $285 a month, that's a lot of money that's not going to be spent in the typical ways. You're going to feel that locally, right? People aren't going to go to the movies. They aren't going to buy coffee. They're not going out for dinner. All the things that people do with their disposable income, right? They've gotten used to having this extra $285 a month over the last 3 years. Now they don't have it.
What surprised me was the 285 figure, because you hear all these stories about people, not being able to make ends meet because of student loans. 285, I mean, okay, it's a lot for somebody who's starting out, but that doesn't break the bank for most people, I wouldn't think. It's far less than a new car payment.
Sure, but that's just the average, right? So you've got people well above that and well below it. I think even at 285, you're going to see some real changes in local economies. This is going to be a shock to a lot of people, especially people who have businesses who have been doing relatively well the last 2 years, maybe even 3, in no small part because people all of a sudden had more money to spend, and now they're not going to. So I don't know where this all ends up. I just know that it ends up in a place different from where we've become accustomed to living, which, of course, brings us to the foolishness of the week. And this hinges on the death of Dianne Feinstein. And as our listeners know, we don't really talk about deaths of politicians all that much. I think people are a little too happy when opponents die. I think it's disgusting, truth be told. I have nothing to say about Dianne Feinstein one way or the other. I was never a colossal fan. I take no joy in her death. But now that she has passed, that opens up a problem in California. What do you do about the empty seat? And the governor, of course, is allowed to appoint a successor. And that's going to involve all kinds of infighting and wrangling to begin with. But at the end of her term, whenever that happens to be, well, that seat comes open and there's going to be a gigantic fight over who gets it. Because as you've seen, you can go be a United States senator, especially if you're a Democrat from California, for 30 years. You got this idea that Oprah Winfrey is a possibility and this kind of thing, but that didn't interest me near as much as this business of Meghan Markle throwing her hat into this ring. And if you think she didn't throw her hat into the ring, why on earth is she being considered at all? Trust me, she's the prime mover here. She let it be known that she was interested, and now people are talking about her. They're talking about her as a bit of a long shot, but for the love of God, what are you people in California thinking?
What is she thinking? My understanding is they left the royal family because they didn't want to do the whole public thing and dealing with the press and all of that business. They wanted to have private lives, and now she's turning around and throwing her hat in the ring to be a politician? That makes no sense.
Does it seem to you as if those two people have had private lives? Do you think they really want private lives? They don't want private lives. They just don't want the lives of British responsibility. And I've got nothing to say about that one way or the other. I frankly don't care about the British royal family. Cue the hate mail from our British listeners. That said, what on earth qualifies her to be a United States senator? She married a British royal. That seems to be the thing that is her claim to fame, as it were. Is that what it takes to be a senator now? Hell if I know. It seems that that is not the right answer. Now, I don't know what the right answer is for the people of California, largely because I think that they've been offering the wrong answers for so long that I don't know what to tell them. That's a one-party state, and it runs about as well as one-party states do. But boy, I think Gavin Newsom's got a problem on his hands here. I doubt he perceives it as such. But he should really go out of his way to appoint somebody to that seat who is a potential long-term answer, not just somebody to fill the remainder of a term.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
We're here with attorney Vince White. I used to know him when he was just student Vince White. One of my most successful former students, one of whom I am most proud. And here I sit with friend Vince White. I kind of want to call you Vinny.
You can.
I really can't. You're not a Vinny in your heart. It's just never going to work.
On my birth certificate, I'm a Vincent.
Really?
Yeah.
How'd that happen?
Quebec.
Really?
I'm originally Canadian.
I knew I didn't like you for some reason.
They didn't either. That was the first time I was deported.
The first time you were deported?
Yes. I had the honor of being deported from Canada and then later in life from Japan.
How did you get deported from Japan?
I was living in Nagasaki. So I was living under my Canadian papers for obvious reasons. And I showed my Canadian passport with my U.S. alien registration card. And the Japanese authorities were kind enough to say, that's not legal. And it wasn't yet. It wasn't until recently that you could have a dual citizenship with Canada. And they were kind enough to pack up my entire apartment. I got a call from my roommates saying, hey, there's people here taking all of your things. And they booked me a first-class flight back to the US and shipped everything in my apartment. I was home within 48 hours. It was the politest deporting I've ever experienced. Hopefully the last.
Nice to know that two countries got good and tired of your nonsense and sent you packing.
Yeah, I'm surprised they get to stick around here, frankly.
Anyway, people are probably wondering why I'm giving you such a hard time. It's clearly because you got out from underneath my influence and became a lawyer. I probably told you repeatedly not to do it.
You did. There's only one way to fail that's hot. You got to be a lawyer.
I guess that's right. So what kind of law do you practice? What's it been like since you left college, and where are you at right now?
Labor and employment. We actually do more workplace sexual harassment and workplace discrimination claims nationwide than any other firm in the U.S. It's been an interesting ride.
Who are we? So you have your own firm.
Oh, I'm so sorry. White and Hilferty, popularly known as NYC Job Attorney. We had a couple of the Harvey Weinstein cases. We've had some high-profile cases over the years. But the bread and butter is just being in all 50 states representing victims of discrimination and sexual harassment. And that's what we do. We fly attorneys around the country. We operate a YouTube channel that receives some attention and helps people find us. And it's an interesting practice. I love what we do. I'm a huge fan of what we call Striketober, which is big in our industry. Unions often go on strike in the fall. And Striketober came early this year, and I have a lot of thoughts on it. And I assume that a political scientist and an economist might tell me how wrong I am.
Well, go ahead, and then we'll see what happens.
All right. Let's start with the United Auto Workers. Have you been familiarized at all with the idea that they're looking for a 40% pay increase?
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard that.
That sounds very unreasonable. That's the headline everywhere people put it out there. I want to raise a couple of issues, though. First, back in 2007, they took a 4-year pay freeze. That combined with the way things have been going in the country, over the past 2 decades, they've actually had a 20% reduction in what the auto workers are earning when you adjust for inflation. And that's really not that unreasonable then. That 40% ask, when you take into account that 20% reduction, to me seems fairly reasonable. But you want to stack that next to the fact they also lost their cost of living protections, their COLA protections. And if they had kept those protections, as of 2022, they would be earning almost exactly what they're asking for today in that 40% increase. Surprise, surprise, they're also asking for those cost of living protections back. And in that context, it all sounds pretty reasonable. But I guess my question for you is, first and foremost, can we have cost of living protections in these negotiations in a world where inflation is so volatile? Is that something that large businesses can even agree to in this day and age?
This is where the economist jumps in.
Yeah, what bothers me about built-in cost of living protection is I can't help but wonder if we set ourselves up for a feedback loop. Imagine an extreme case where every job has cost of living protection, and we go through some period of inflation. And so now we need cost of living bumps by the same amount, which increases costs of production. And now we've got more inflation and the thing echoes. So it seems to me that built-in cost of living protections is going to take some kind of economic shock that would come along and hit prices and would otherwise hit them in a short term and just drag that out for a long period of time.
I see the wisdom in what you're saying. I also see the wisdom on the union side demanding on them. I see digging in your heels and saying, it's not our job to care what happens everywhere else to everyone else. It's our job to care about what happens to these workers right now. I think it's perfectly reasonable to demand the COLA adjustments over time.
Well, but I want to back up a step. We did an episode maybe a week or two ago about unions, and union membership in the private sector is declining as it is, and we were talking about what value unions are bringing. How is it that the United Auto Workers managed to get their workers into a situation where they're basically down 40% in purchasing power versus what they should be?
Well, they've had a large change in their elected representation. So one of the things that we've seen is not all unions are created equal. And a lot of unions, you saw this with the railroad union, they were not really carrying out their duties to their constituency. They were cutting deals that were very good for the union and not really that beneficial to the union member. Now you have this new populist running the UAW, Sean Fain, and he's being painted with a very aggressive brush as a populist and being tied to Trump. Although, frankly, he seems to be fighting with Trump right now. And this new leadership is trying to right the course. At least that's the pitch.
Well, if memory serves, wasn't it the case that the automakers had to give considerable concessions 2007, 8, 9 just to stay in business? They were teetering on insolvency, every last one of them.
They were indeed. And The United Auto Workers did make concessions.
Right.
They gave up the COLA protections. They did that 4-year pay freeze.
But this is why that had to happen.
It is.
It didn't just come out of nowhere.
It did not.
There were good reasons for it.
Certainly. But the big three automakers right now have a $21 billion profit margin in the first half of this year.
Right.
We're in a different place.
Right. So what we see here is a bunch of greedy auto workers saying, okay, we understand that our very jobs are at stake. Take these concessions. A bunch of greedy auto producers said, great, we'll take those. Then they made lots and lots of money years after that and didn't give any of it back to the workers.
Exactly.
So from where I'm sitting, I mean, there's plenty of villains here to go around, but really, if you demand concessions from your workers and then conditions change materially, you should at some point find yourself back at a table saying, okay, what can we do?
Or if you did your job correctly the first time, you would have built that into the original concessions.
Plenty of blame to go around here, but this is a situation that never really should have come along. The parties to this disagreement should have found a way to get through this.
Certainly agree there. I think we have consensus on that.
You know, I understand why that doesn't happen, and so does everybody else in the world. Nonetheless.
Sure. We all have been seeing all these headlines about the Teamsters and what they did for the UPS workers and how some of the UPS workers are now making $170K a year. And I had a question about that. First and foremost, it doesn't seem so insane to me, given the inflation we've experienced. You go to the grocery store today, a family of four is probably eating about $350 a week. It's a lot of money. But I was also curious, is that a shift where we're recognizing that a lot of office jobs can be done by AI? Delivering packages cannot.
Yeah.
They're not replaceable.
Not yet.
Not yet.
Drone deliveries are coming, and all those UPS guys are going to be in a lot of trouble then.
But also there's a phenomenon here that as you replace workers with machines, the workers who remain become much more valuable. Because one worker now can produce 10 times what one worker could before because that one worker is using these various machines as an aid.
And inflation seems to have hit New York City, where you live, way harder than it's hit here, because if you had $350 a week in groceries in Tucson, Arizona, you're feeding more than a family of four.
Sir, I live in rural New Hampshire, and that grocery bill is from rural New Hampshire. I assure you.
Really?
I don't know what they're charging for groceries in rural New Hampshire, but boy, I want to run up there and open a grocery store right now.
That's why I opened a little hobby farm there. I'm going to supply the community myself.
Not a bad idea.
Food is incredibly expensive now.
When you're thinking about inflation, food is really what you should be thinking about. Food and probably housing and energy. These are the things that we try to gloss out of the equation when we talk about these things in public because they're, quote, too volatile. So I don't know that we do ourselves a lot of favors when we start talking about inflation unless we can be pretty clear what we're talking about. And when you start thinking about what workers are up against, and this is where you're at when you're thinking about strikes, well, workers are up against increased prices, and those prices are determining how they live their lives. And when it looks to be the case that the money they make on the job isn't enough to take care of those needs anymore, you can bet there's going to be some friction. How do you think there won't be? So here we are. And it would seem to me that during times like this, your kind of law office is probably doing pretty well.
It is. We're recession proof, and we have a built-in COLA protection of our own. Because on a given case, we argue, hey, we have to adjust how much our client would win for inflation. And we're on a percentage of what we win for our clients. So when the economy suffers, unfortunately, or fortunately, I suppose, I benefit.
You started off this conversation by saying that you wanted us to point out where you're wrong. I haven't heard any disagreement amongst us yet.
Yeah, I'm very, very surprised.
Well, say something stupid.
Or let James.
All right, I will say something stupid. So I agree with James that perhaps it makes more sense to have food involved in the calculation of how inflation is calculated. Antony, am I an insane person?
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the breakdown versions of inflation. I think inflation is inflation. I like to look at the whole number. But I get it that there are certain things that are, particularly if you're looking over a short period of time, there are certain things that are so volatile that as they move, they're not communicating any useful information. It's just noise that you're getting. And so you want to filter it out. But if you're going to look over long haul, you want to look at the whole measure.
Gas prices are the perfect example. Right here in Tucson now, gas prices are well over $4 a gallon. Does that have anything to do with inflation? Probably not. Probably more to do with seasonal considerations. At this time of year, gas is almost always more expensive. These things are hard to deal with.
Yeah, and you point to gas because you notice it. And this is one of the errors that people often make when they think about inflation. They readily see prices going up. They're not as quick to see prices going down. And so they see, this one price go up and say, oh, we've got the inflation, completely ignoring the fact that 3 other prices dropped by just as much, and they're actually better off.
But food is rough. That grocery bill, when you walk through a grocery store and take a look at the prices that people are paying every day now, it's very clear that there has been an intervening variable that has changed things in the way Americans live their lives. And their wages haven't caught up to that yet, and aren't going to for quite a while, if I'm reading the tea leaves correctly. So when you get a union demanding some kind of return to normalcy for their membership, it's very hard for me to get all worked up over it. And in people see, I think you're right to point to that 40% figure, White, and say, look, people see that and they think, what a bunch of greedy people. And I get that. That sure is what it seems like. But nobody ever does report on the concessions they've made for more than a decade.
Exactly. I think there's an interesting thing here of white collar workers versus blue collar workers, because you have we'll go with the HR professional who often makes 100, 150K, whatever it is, seeing a UPS worker outstrip them all of a sudden. And they think not, maybe I should earn more. They think, how can they earn more than me? There's this jealousy of worker tearing at worker, but it might be a recognition that it's really hard to be UPS worker. Those are long days in brutally hot conditions, moving stuff that's incredibly heavy in high traffic environments. That's a tough, tough job. And it seems like we might be starting to adjust how we value jobs a little bit with some of that.
This is something that we do all the time when people complain about how much CEOs make. And I repeatedly say that we complain in large part because we don't understand what they do. And so we just assume, well, whatever they're doing certainly isn't worth that. And you know this because you don't hear people complaining about movie stars and professional athletes who make as much or more than many CEOs.
Right. Nobody ever says, I could do what LeBron James does.
I actually had a note because I watched your show reminding me not to mention how much the CEO of any of the big 3 makes. I feel very gratified, but right now at this moment. Okay, last thing. Maybe this will rile you up, James. I don't know. We'll see. A lot of pensions are not indexed for inflation. If you weren't a firefighter or in the military or some police officers, generally your pension is not indexed for inflation. And I see a lot of pensions right now not livable. What do we do about that as a country? How do we address that? How do we keep it from happening in a world where people can just print money? If that is a driving factor in inflation, I'm not assuming it, but if it is, and that then degrades the value of a pension, how can one work for a pension in this day and age?
Yeah, that's a big deal. And I hate to pass the buck here, but I would put these criticisms under the topic of financial literacy, that people are accepting jobs, accepting terms without understanding the financial implications of what they're accepting. So you see, well, we've got this pension, it's going to pay X dollars when you retire, and you think, oh yeah, that's 20 years, 30, 40 years off into the future. I don't care so much about that. You're not thinking through how this is going to work, let alone thinking through the fact that, well, on top of that, if I want a certain standard of living, I need to start saving right now a certain amount and invest it well. I find that most Americans don't start performing that calculus until it's too late. They hit their 50s or their 60s. They need to be thinking that at their 20s.
I think they do think about that in their 50s. And I think another culprit here is Social Security, which falls into the exact same description. People think they're going to have it. They're paying for it. The money's being siphoned out of their check week after week. And yet we all know, being reasonable human beings, that becomes more worthless with each passing year. And there will come a time when it's absolutely worthless. So here we are. And Vince, I think the phrasing of your question, I think, was meant to bait me. Because you laid out a problem, and I think you did that quite nicely and quite reasonably. And then you said, and I quote, what are we going to do about that? And I don't think we have to do anything about that. I think people who have pensions maybe are on the hook for that. Because if we collectively start bailing out pensions, are we going to bail out all the people who don't have pensions? Because there's a whole lot of people who don't even have them. Why are we going to go bailing out people who do? I don't think we should do anything. This is on the backs of those who hold the paper. If you made a deal, you're going to have to live with that deal. If it was a bad deal, maybe the best we can say is that the next generation won't make a similar deal.
Generally agree with you. Counterpoint. they did change the game on them a little bit.
How so?
Nobody expected them to print a third of all money in circulation in the matter of 18 months. It's kind of hard to guess that that's going to happen.
They changed that game on all of us all the time. Every single American. Matter of fact, I think you can make the case that people worldwide have to deal with the ramifications of that.
Yes.
The game was just changed. That doesn't make anybody more special. I think we're all in the process of getting hosed by this.
When you say the game was changed, you're talking about the quantitative easing and the subsequent inflation?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
And how could that not be true? I'm thankful, at least, that some of the people on the Republican side of the aisle are finally admitting that Donald Trump printed $6 trillion. It's so ridiculous that finally people are admitting the actual truth. This took decades to happen. This was always a problem on the other side of the aisle for some reason, but never on our own.
Oh, yeah.
So finally people are, I think, waking up and realizing that we've got a colossal problem of our own making here, and it's the kind of problem that actually does come to touch everything. It's not a wound you can cauterize. This is systemic now. And how you come to deal with this, I don't know. I mean, I think that you've gotten to the point now where the problem is so profound that it might be unsolvable. And Ant, you can dial me back there if you think it's appropriate. But I think we might have crossed that line.
I think so. Actually, I got a question the other day from some news organization in Asia asking just what you asked. And I said, well, economically, it is soluble. And laid out the thing we've talked about before of cut federal spending 10%, hold federal spending constant thereafter for 6 years, all of that. Economically, it's soluble. Politically, there is no way it's going to be solved because we've landed ourselves in the tragedy of the commons problem. It is the same exact problem you would have if 535 people went out for dinner and the arrangement was whatever the bill was, we're going to split it evenly. And first thing that's going to happen, all of a sudden everybody's ordering champagne and steak. Because although I can't afford it, I know that the price is going to be pushed on to everybody else. So, and by the way, I might as well order it because Vince and James are going to do the same thing, trying to push the price onto me.
You know he will.
And it sounds so trite, but there's only one answer. And that answer is to keep the federal government within its constitutional constraints. You let it out of its constitutional constraints and you will have this insoluble problem every single time.
Yeah. And government is a simple thing, really, in the end. There are certain functions only government can accomplish. So you set those off to the side, you create a government to satisfy those needs, and then you don't let it do anything else ever. Because the minute you let it do one unnecessary thing, all the other unnecessary things come flying through the door. And what we want replaces what we need so quickly and so easily that you never really see the problem that's created. Because we're so good at telling each other and ourselves what we want. We're so good at it. What we need is a much harder thing to come to terms with. How to pay for it should be a dead indicator, right? I mean, where's all the money coming from to pay for all the stuff you want? And if you want analogies, this is like saying to your 7, 8, and 9-year-old children, here, take this credit card. There's no such thing as Santa Claus, but go nuts this year. Buy whatever you want. And if you think that children wouldn't go absolutely crazy with your credit card, you've never had children. They absolutely would. And I wouldn't blame them for one flippin' second.
Vince, you've let us rant. I want to go back to you as a guest. Tell us more about the sorts of cases that your law firm is doing. Tell us something interesting there.
Oh, my goodness. Well,
Hey, let's do this, Ant. Vince, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
wow. New exciting in my world. I have come to the conclusion that union busting is legal for a price based on recent fines levied out to Starbucks. So I've been working on some situations tied to that, and I've been thinking about that a lot. But in terms of my field, it's really always the same. You look at how people are treated, protected class, is that why someone's being targeted, and then what was done to them. And frankly, the employers tend to agree the settlement rate's above 98%. The cost of litigation is so high, they can't really fight. It's a very interesting industry in that way.
Vince, can you back up a second? Because a lot of our listeners are going to be very interested in something you just said.
Yeah.
And this ties into something that a frequent guest we have, Clark Neely, talks about a lot too. He's not on the same side of the coin you are, right? We're not talking about workers and contracts and what have you. But we are talking about court proceedings, and it is too expensive, right? You're in a position where for an employer actually to follow through in courts of law, they have to absolutely know they're going to win, don't they?
Realistically, I do. And my clients are in a nice position because we can come in and say, hey, let us pay for everything. We're going to cover everything for you. And we're going to litigate this case all the way through federal court to a trial. And we know that means that more than 98% of our cases will settle. Because at the end of the day, that means it's going to cost them $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 to fight us off. And often my clients be perfectly happy with $200,000.
On that 2% that don't settle, do you ever have clients who refuse to settle? Do they comprise part of that 2%? Do any of them ever say, there is no amount of money they can offer me that I will take? I want them to pay.
We do. Absolutely. That's why you keep the trial team. You need to keep the other side honest, and you're going to have those clients who want the trials.
Right.
And you finally get to use that incredibly expensive trial team when you find the client who doesn't care about the risk and wants to go forward.
Just off the cuff, I don't need a detailed answer, nor do I need it to be exactly correct. Of those clients who refuse to settle, how many of them actually win?
So the funny thing about the cases that refuse to settle is they're often the cases that are coin flips. The settlement didn't come up high enough because no one was sure if the case was going to win or not.
Right.
The absolute winners, they settle and it's a blank check. How many zeros, right? The bad cases, they settle because the person who has the case knows they should take what they can get. The cases that are just very uncertain, those are the ones that go to trial. And you do see, depending on your jury pool, roughly 50-50. If you're in the Bronx, 90-10. If you're in Oakland, 90-10. But in most of the country, you're looking at about a 50-50 win rate on this kind of case. So nobody wants to risk trial.
Right. So it's interesting. Your job, in no small part, is more about assessment than anything else.
It is. And it's a really nice situation to be in. It's horrible in one way because you're telling people who probably do have claims, who have been wronged and attacked on the very level of their identity. You're telling them, hey, I can't help you. I can't put 80, 90 grand into your case because I don't know if we can win it. I believe you, but I'm not going to help. That's pretty horrible.
You just said something that I think a lot of people don't really understand. You have to invest your resources into these cases, right? You are paying your money into these cases, hoping that you'll get a favorable outcome. But this is an investment for you.
Oh, very much so. Hundreds of cases a year. Yes.
Explain to people what goes into that and what kind of figures you're really looking at. How much of your own money is at risk when you move forward with a case?
Depends on the stage. Let's say you file with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, an agency that most people in the U.S. will be aware of. I'm probably in for 10 to 20 grand somewhere throughout that process. But if that case then goes on, it doesn't settle, it goes on to federal court, I'm paying for expert witnesses who might charge me $20,000, $30,000, $50,000. It depends. Depends on how famous your therapist is or your doctor. Forensic IT, I could easily sink 30 grand into that. Might be worth it. I might find that they deleted a bunch of racial slurs and that would sure help the case. And you have to do it because my duty is to the client. But that's just the investment before you even look at running a law firm, paying the attorneys to put labor and hours into the case. Hundreds of attorney hours, hundreds in a case like this.
Do you ever have a problem where you've got a case and you've determined that it's not a winner or the guy should settle and he insists on taking it to trial and you're looking at that saying there's no way we're going to win and I'm going to be forced to drop 5-6 figures on paying for this thing? And I would presume under ethical rules, you've got to move forward if the guy wants to move forward. Is that the case?
Incredibly common. It's incredibly common. And what we call that is the client catching a case of the greedies. Very normal. You're correct that we're stuck on the case. The only way we can really get off the case is if we achieve 100% of the economic damages that could be won in the case in a settlement offer. If the client's demanding more than they could hope to win in the eyes of the court will say, okay, you can get off. And what you will see, it's kind of interesting. You'll see defense counsel making offers structured to get you to 100% because they want you to leave the case. But I don't want to do that. I don't want to leave somebody high and dry. It's a difficult position to be in.
You said something in passing I want to go back to, that you were dealing with union busting in Starbucks. Union busting, to my understanding, is illegal. What have they done to get rid of unions?
So this is pretty interesting. I don't want to list off everything they've done, but they've been a big fan, first and foremost, of closing locations where people are organizing unions. And they were fined for it to the tune of millions. But in the context, a union can cost Starbucks far more than $30 million a year. I mean, it'd be a tremendous change in business for that company. For them to take a fine of $30 million, what a steal, what a bargain. But the NLRB doesn't have a provision where it can look at the size of a company. And that is how it structures the fines. When I bring a sexual harassment case, if there's a retaliation component, I get to make the argument that because of the company's size, the punitive damages should grow.
Oh.
Otherwise, they won't learn their lesson. That's not a part of the laws that govern union busting. You can't look at the bankroll. If you go after Apple for union busting, Apple doesn't care. The richest company in the world. Liquid for millennia. They don't care. They care far more about not having a union to deal with. If you bring a sexual harassment retaliation case against Apple, the sky's the limit. Because how will they learn their lesson if it's not structured based on how much cash they have at hand? It's a very different way to structure the law. I've been looking at that and looking at the way the UAW is now trying to ensure that certain plants are not shut down, because it seems like the big three automakers are shutting down plants that are most active in the union and then opening them up one state over with a better tax deal. This is very common in this day and age, and the laws don't seem to be addressing it.
Vince, I gotta say, you ended up in a real interesting kind of life. You just kind of started working hard the way a lot of people do. You made some pretty wise choices, but you also made some pretty difficult ones. You rolled the dice. You really risked a lot on your career in a way that people who play it safe don't. And now you've got a pretty interesting, satisfying life as a result. So I want to say to everybody who's listening right now that I'm going to say goodbye to Vince in just a second. But we're not leaving Vince in just a second. The Patreon folks are going to get to hear some war stories from Vince. I'm going to ask him some interesting questions that only some of you get to hear. So go join our Patreon, for crying out loud. You know, we have to pay the bills to keep this podcast running. Help us out a little bit, will you? But Vince, until then, until we get to that portion of the program, if you could close us out today by telling people why it is you took such a gamble on yourself early on in your life, and what advice you would have for younger people who are maybe in college right now or in high school thinking about going to college, about the costs and benefits of this kind of decision that you made early in your life.
I was a trailer park rat. I never expected to go to college. I had a teacher fill out my application to the university where I met James, and then I had amazing professors invest in me, and I became a vastly different person than I thought I would ever be.
And we should say, Vince, before we go any further, given the audience of this particular question and what I have asked you, I give White a ration of crap all the time about being a lousy student. He most certainly was no lousy student. Vince was one of the best most hardworking students I had. He was earnest. He showed up to class every day. He did his work. He never complained, which is way more important than I think people realize. And you did everything a hardworking, earnest student does. So I don't want to take anything away from you in the name of giving you a hard time.
It's very kind. I was an aggressively mediocre student at best, but I appreciate the kindness. But I knew no one was ever going to take a bet on me. I had a job in 2008 at an investment bank. I had specialized in securities law because I thought, hey, that's where the money is. If you can serve those people, you'll have money. And in 2008, the financial crisis happened, and they said to me, hey, we're going to keep you. You're one of the ones we're keeping, but we are going to cut your salary in half, which would have actually still been not so bad, if I'm being honest. But I had worked in employment law, and in employment law, you earn what you win. If I win someone $100,000, I'll be pocketing probably $33,000. It's the purest form of meritocracy. By hook or by crook, you control the public narrative, you do what you have to do, you prove your case, and the limits of your ability to prove your case is human imagination. If you can prove your case and win someone and help someone, you've helped yourself. And that to me was an opportunity to say, I think I can win. I think I could win. And I don't think these people have the density of soul, because this industry, it's complex litigation. These people, they view themselves as white shoe attorneys. They do not view me as that. But I can sit here and trade with you in a way that the average attorney maybe doesn't want to, doesn't care to. So I said, listen, they don't understand this industry. They don't know that this is the best way to help people and turn time into money. And that's why I went out on my own about 1.5 years into the field. I said, enough of this. I'm going solo.
So what advice would you have for young people?
You have to bet on yourself. You have to invest in yourself and bet on yourself. You can't bet on anyone else, because even if they win, they're going to go somewhere else. It's got to be you.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.